Really simple, actually. It's just a little packet of information that gets stored on your browser. Fundamentally, cookies are tied to a domain. The whole idea behind them, they're not inherently good or bad in and of themselves. They're just a mechanism for passing information from one page to another.
Hello, and welcome back to the Clicks to Customers podcast. This is John Horn, CEO of Stub Group. We are a digital advertising agency that helps businesses make money online and dominate Google Ads. And today I am joined by Matt Bentley. Matt is the head of data architecture and analytics at Loop Horizon. Matt, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, really good
Absolutely.
to be here.
So Matt is calling in from the UK, a little bit ahead of the day, his time than ours, but he's taking some time out of his day to dig into some various topics around cookies and compliance and tracking. And before those people who are watching, before your eyes glaze over and be like, oh, well, this doesn't matter to me, it is actually incredibly important to you. This is super important to all advertisers, small, medium, large, because of a couple of reasons. A, on the legal side of things, there are a lot of legal implications related to what you collect or don't collect on your website. There are, real monetary realities that can be impacted by what you do or don't do in terms of tracking. And then also from just a business performance perspective, the way that you track how people are getting to your website, how they're using your website, how they're returning to your website, those all play a big role in understanding how your marketing channels are working, how your ad spend is performing, etc. So a lot of stuff we're going to dive into that is incredibly relevant to anybody in the business space who has a website where people are visiting that website. So Matt, to kick off, I'd love to kind of start from the basics. We'll talk a lot about cookies today and other things as well, but a lot of conversation about cookies. So could you just describe, what are cookies, how do they work, and also as part of that, what's the difference between first-party cookies and third-party cookies?
Yeah, sure. So, a cookie is really simple, actually. It's just a little packet of information that gets stored on your browser, and they can contain any sort of information. It's text. And they contain information such as unique identifiers, or they might contain information about the products in a basket, that kind of thing. And the whole idea behind them, they're not inherently good or bad in and of themselves. They're just a mechanism for passing information from one page to another. So if you are in a web browser and you make a call to retrieve the information to serve a web page, that will build the web page in your browser, and there will be there'll be images and there'll be text and things like that. That gets rebuilt every time the page reloads, and so without cookies or some form of storage, you can't pass information from one page load to the next. And so fundamentally, a cookie will just maintain and persist information from one page load to the next. Now, they can last much longer than that, up to some cookies are up to 2 years, some are even longer than that, although there are a lot of restrictions within browsers for how long cookies can last for. But fundamentally, it's just passing information from one page load to the next. The ones that persist for longer than that are then looking at passing information from one session to the next. And so then you get into situations where I have a cookie with a unique identifier, for example, and let's take web analytics as an example. So you might have a unique identifier. What a cookie for the purposes of web analytics might do is just have a unique identifier to say that this is this browser, and from one page load to the next, from one session to the next, it can tie that activity together into a session or a visit, and then subsequently into a user profile. But the cookie isn't doing that. All the cookie is doing is persisting the ID. It's then the way that's then processed in the back end that's of those tools that is tying that together and creating these profiles. And then you mentioned first party and third party cookies. So fundamentally, cookies are tied to a domain. They're all tied to a domain, and so it's about the context in which the cookie is being set, in which the cookie is being read. So a first party cookie, if I'm on a website, example.com, and I have a cookie and that cookie is tied to example.com, then that is a first party cookie because it can be read by JavaScript, if it's a JavaScript readable cookie, and we'll get it's a bit more nuance around that, but it can be read by JavaScript on example.com, and it can also be read in network requests that go to an example.com endpoint. If, on the other hand, I'm on example.com and there is a cookie that is tied to google.com, then that is a third-party cookie. So no JavaScript nor any of the header requests from example.com can read that cookie. However, if you have some script on your website that is sending data to google.com, so some JavaScript on your website that's sending to google.com, then the cookie that's tied to google.com will be sent in the header request to google.com, and so that's a third-party cookie. And what that means is that if this cookie that's tied to google.com and you go to multiple websites and they all set some script that sends data to an endpoint of google.com, then it will be able to read the same identifier, and so it can understand that that's the same user browsing the web across multiple different websites.
And that would be how many platforms like Google, for example, understand how people are engaging with things across the web. They're hitting different websites that have Google code, and so they know, okay, this is what they're interested in, kind of building a profile about people. Is that accurate? Yeah,
exactly. Of course, third-party cookies that are not long for this world, but historically that's how advertising would work. Yeah, it would you would track users around the web, you would infer interests and intent, and then that's how the large advertisers would build up these user profiles, and then allow you to target against those users for advertising purposes.
For most consumers, the one place where they kind of see cookies or think about it or exposed to it is usually in the banner that pops up when you go to a website and it says, hey, we've got cookies, accept, reject, that type of thing. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening when those banners pop up and what's happening when people engage the different options that are available to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends if it's been configured correctly. So what's meant to happen is you go on a website. I mean, obviously, I'm based in Europe, and I'm based in the UK, but up until very recently in the EU. So we've been doing this for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, I think. But yeah, so essentially, what's meant to happen is you land on a web page, and only tags and cookies, so only scripts. I'll call them scripts for now. There's sort of this idea that it's cookies. It's not really cookies. It's the scripts that are reading the cookies in them. What those scripts are doing with the cookies that's important. The cookies themselves aren't necessarily that important, because unless you do something with it, it's just a packet of information that lives in your browser. So you would land on one of these websites, and only things that were essential to delivering the service to you as a user, and this is a GDPR context, should be set before consent has been granted, because in the EU we have an express consent, so you have to give consent before running any script or loading any cookies. So you would land on a website, only those things essential to delivering the service to you would load, and by essential that's basically you as a user have requested a website. If by denying these tags and cookies the website doesn't work, then I've been unable to present you with the service that you've asked for, and so that we have to load the tags and the cookies that are essential for that service. So an example of that might be the consent management platform itself is classed as an essential tag. Then you would interact with the cookie banner, you would accept the cookies, you would decline the cookies, or you would go and look for more information and you'd switch certain consent categories on and off. And then once you accept, assuming that you do accept, then a signal will be sent from the consent management platform to the website to say which consent categories have been accepted. You as a company should have done prior work leading up to that to group all of your tags and cookies into these consent categories, and then based on the signals returned from the consent management platform, you can then load or not load tags dependent on what the user has agreed to. And then any subsequent load would honour those consent choices. So a really obvious example would be one of the more ubiquitous consent management platforms on the market is OneTrust. OneTrust can be configured in the OneTrust front end to return information back to Google Tag Manager. So if you're a company that uses Google Tag Manager, you will load your web page, you will load Google Tag Manager, you'll also load OneTrust. You might place Google Tag Manager within OneTrust if you don't want to load it pre-consent, but let's just say for this example you load them both. And then Google Tag Manager has a data layer that is associated with it, so just an array on the page that you can push information into. And what will happen is that OneTrust will push information into that array to say that only essential cookies have been accepted at this point. In your Google Tag Manager, you will have aligned all of your tags, all of your non-essential tags, to consent groups that aren't the essential consent group, and so essentially none of those will fire. The user will then interact with OneTrust. OneTrust will push more information back onto the data layer, and now you'll get the full consent groups that the user has consented to. So assuming that they have accepted consent for all of your non-essential cookies and tags, you'd then get signals back into that data layer to say that analytics has been accepted, advertising has been accepted, and so on. And then based on those signals from the consent management platform, you would then run the tags in Google Tag Manager that relate to those consent groups. And then that would then happen on every subsequent page load, where OneTrust would reconfirm what's been accepted and what hasn't. And then after about a year, assuming that you're not in a browser that caps cookies at a 7-day, 24-hour, 7-day time span, after about a year or maybe 6 months, whatever cadence you defined in OneTrust, the cookie that defines those consents with OneTrust would expire. You get the pop-up banner and the whole process would start again, and you would be asked to reconsent. So it's usually either 6 or 12 months.
Okay. So that banner is really acting as a trigger, or I should say, the action you're taking, and that banner acts as the trigger. If you say accept, then boom, it triggers over to Google Tag Manager or whatever to say, all right, now you can fire this series of things, and now you can track in, let's say, your Google Ads remarketing list or your Meta Pixel or things like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what it's really doing is the OneTrust consent management platform will have a unique identifier in a cookie. Every time OneTrust loads, it will go off and check that unique identifier against the consents that they have saved in their back end, and it will return those consents. And so it's constantly updating itself to make sure it's always got the latest consents that the user has granted. And then that's exactly right. So based on those consents, OneTrust, which is, in most cases, it's just some JavaScript running on the site, it will confirm those consents and it will return to the data layer which consent groups have been accepted and which ones haven't, or well, the ones that haven't will just be excluded. And then you, as a responsible business owner and company, will have aligned your tag management solution to those consents. So what we tend to tell clients, we have a number of examples where we've gone in and spoken to clients and they're using browser level events. And so this sounds like it's a bit left field, but essentially it was the way that things were done sort of maybe 5 or 6, 7 years ago. And you would fire tags based on what the browser was telling you. So the browser would say, the page is loaded, so I'm going to try and fire my tags now. And then what something like Google Tag Manager or Adobe Launch or Telium would be doing is, on those browser level events, page top, page load, DOM ready, etc., would be trying to check the consent values. The problem with that approach is you can get race conditions. So what a race condition is where something is relying on a piece of data that doesn't exist yet. And I've seen examples where a user has consented to tags, but for whatever reason the company's loading OneTrust at the bottom of the page rather than the top. And so Google Tag Manager is trying to fire a tag based on a page top event or something like that, a browser level event. OneTrust hasn't loaded yet, and therefore every single time it tries to do this it fails because the consent doesn't exist, and you've inadvertently switched your tagging off even though the user has consented to it. And I've also seen the opposite of that, which is where a tag tries to fire at page top but the consent management platform isn't ready yet, and it's using blocking triggers, so it will fire always unless the consent management platform says that certain consents aren't available. And so what you find then is actually it fires irrespective of the consent management platform. It just fires them anyway, so people can think that they've got a consent management platform correctly deployed, and that they've integrated it with their tag manager, but actually it doesn't work because you get these race conditions. So the way we always advise clients to go is we move away from browser level events and we move to consent management platform events. And so we say, wait for the consent to come back, and then trigger all of your tags off that event that says that consent has been returned, and then that way you never get these race conditions.
Is there any measurable impact on page load with one of those, the browser level versus the tag, the consent management platform level? Does using either one make the page load faster or slower, or is it pretty much the same thing?
It depends what you mean. So most JavaScript that you would load through a tag management platform should be loaded asynchronously anyway. So if you're looking at load speed measures like DOM ready or just overall load time, so essentially the main body of the page is rendered, then it doesn't really make any difference because your tags should be loading asynchronously, and so the content should just render to the user irrespective of where you load these JavaScript tags. That said, it can have an impact on things like time to interactive. So asynchronous JavaScript shouldn't affect content loading, but it can affect how quickly the site becomes interactive. And that normally is the case on slower devices. So let's say you're browsing on mobile and you don't have a very strong network connection and it's an older mobile device. Every piece of JavaScript that gets loaded, asynchronous or not, has to be rendered by the browser, and that means the CPU of the device that you're on is having to do work in order to run that JavaScript. So what you can find is that the more, and it's not really the ordering, it's not really whether it's page load or whether we wait for the consent management platform, it's more just the sheer weight of JavaScript that's being loaded. Moving it around can make a difference. So like we saw huge differences for largest contentful paint when we moved script around. And so what we did with one client is we looked at their tag manager. They were loading a lot of tags. We couldn't remove the weight. The tags were important. They were delivering vital marketing activity. But what we saw was that some of those tags delivered the end user experience. So they were things like chatbots or Google Ad Manager, selling ad space, that kind of thing. And some were just doing data collection. And so we split those out and we loaded everything that was delivering content first. And we saw a 6% improvement in LCP for that client. So it can make a difference, but by and large, no, like asynchronous JavaScript doesn't really matter. But where it makes a difference is how quickly that page becomes interactive. And you've seen that yourself. Like you'll be on your phone, you'll be in an area where you don't have excellent signal. The page will render, you'll tap something and nothing will happen.
Right.
And so you'll rage tap it. And then it moves and you end up tapping the wrong thing and it sends you to the wrong place and all of that stuff. Like that's what can be impacted by asynchronous JavaScript. Because asynchronous it might be, but it's still got to get processed. And if the page can't become interactive until that JavaScript has finished processing, particularly if it's trying to run multiple processes all at once, which some of the slower devices can't handle very well, then you can see impact on interactivity and user experience.
Going back to the banners for a second, I've seen different iterations. I've seen some banners where it's say accept, just accept and reject. I've seen some where it's kind of manage preferences. So there's maybe not a reject button right away. You have to click in, and then there's a second place where you can reject cookies. Is one approach better than the other from a compliance perspective? Are there what are the rules? What are your cookie banners supposed to say, and how are they supposed to operate?
So it depends upon your local legislation. GDPR and then the e-privacy regulation that goes along with it, and in the UK that's PECR, is very clear. So the accept and reject buttons are supposed to have equal prominence. So cookie banners that aren't that don't have a reject button, and up until very recently ours didn't, and I've just updated it because I did a white paper around cookie compliance, and I thought, well, I better make sure that our banner is compliant if I'm doing a
just
white
read that, by
paper.
the way. Really good white paper. I recommend
Oh,
anybody watching go download that from your website or LinkedIn profile.
Thank you. And yes, I'll get the report sorted for you and sent over to you. But yeah, the legislation's very clear, and the ICO, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, have been really clear that the accept and reject buttons should have equal prominence. So that's in the UK, and broadly speaking, the rest of Europe. Although again, there are differences on a country by country basis. But then you look at other legislative regions. So I think CCPA is very similar to GDPR. But if you go into Latin America, or Central America, you've got Brazil, for example, or Mexico, where actually you're allowed to set tags before consent. And there isn't, I don't think, anything that talks about a reject button. So realistically, it depends on the market you're operating in. So make sure you understand what the legislation for that market requires, and then adhere to that. The other thing to note is that although the reject all button is required in the UK, understand what it's going to do to your top line figures, because you probably are going to have to do it at some point. And a lot of companies that we're working with at the moment are sort of wrestling with this because they're expecting their consent to drop off significantly. And so there is a toss up, and it's, my advice would be adhere to the legislation. However, you need to look at it in terms of risk, and if there's a risk of being fined, there's risk of brand damage and reputational damage for appearing on the ICO's naughty list. But also there's it's not a risk. You take a bunch of data out, there are real revenue impacts, and so think about that and understand how you're going to mitigate for those before you just go ahead and blithely stick a reject all button in, and make sure you understand exactly what you're doing and that everybody knows who's going to be impacted by it within the business.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because if you're watching this, if you're running a business and you're making decisions based upon, hey, I'm allocating X amount of money to Google Ads, and X amount to Meta Ads, and hey, I've got this much traffic coming, organically through search, and this amount from referral channels, whatever, and then you allow people to easily reject, a lot of people do that, and suddenly you just have much less insight into, okay, well, the ad spend that I'm spending, or the work I'm putting into organic, or whatever it is, is it working? Is it not working? And I've seen that with some of our clients where it can be very challenging. It's like, I only see half of our traffic now, and I don't know. I know people are getting to our website, but I don't know where they're coming from, where this other half is coming from, which dollars are working or not. And it can be really, really challenging for businesses.
And I mean, there are some alternatives. So one that is just gaining prominence in the UK at the moment, particularly with publishers, is a consent or pay model. And that's a little bit different. So if you've got content that the end user wants, and particularly if you're reliant on advertising for your revenue streams, and you would struggle to operate without those revenue streams, a lot of publishers are saying accept cookies or sign up for a subscription. And so depending on your business model, that might be something you would look into. And it sounds like, as soon as I heard it, I thought, that sounds a bit like a cookie wall. That sounds like you're not providing content to users unless they agree to be tracked. But the ICO's line on this at the moment from a UK perspective is that they're actually advising brands to look into it. They haven't gone as far as confirming that it's legal or in line with the legislation, but they also have not said that it isn't. And they've given some guidance around how you could do this in a way that is compliant. And so some of the guidance around it is things like, make sure that the paid version and the version with cookies are comparable, so you're not hiding functionality. Make sure that it's just as easy to decline again. If users consent and then they want to decline, make sure it's very easy to find out how to do that. Now, a few of the examples I've looked at, they don't really do that. So one example for a media company, it was very easy to accept the cookies, but then trying to find the link to go decline them again wasn't very easy. I mean, it was in the footer, and that's where it normally is, but there's some sort of ambiguous wording. And then the other thing is it's a media company, so you had almost endless scroll before you could reach the footer, particularly on mobile. So it was very difficult to then retract consent once it had been given. But that's certainly something that you could look into, and not just for publishers. I was speaking to a retailer, and they haven't gone down this route. And to be honest, I think it would need more validation. But the immediate thought that I had was not to pay for content, but if you're a retailer, you want people to sign in, because third-party cookies are on their way out. They were meant to be gone from later this year, early 2025, and then Google have obviously done a U-turn on removing third-party cookies from Chrome. But they've not existed in Safari since 2019, and for some brands that's like up to 50% of their browser traffic is Safari. So realistically, if you're relying on third-party cookies alone, you're probably struggling from a marketing perspective, from a targeting perspective. And one of the alternatives is a first-party data marketing strategy. So, maximizing your CRM data, if you want, taking information out of your digital analytics platforms when you're allowed to collect it, joining it with your CRM data, modeling that data to identify high-value audiences, and then uploading those via hashed email, for example, directly into the DSP, so directly into Meta, directly into Google. That is an alternative to third-party cookies. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, if you can bring the sign-in to the very start of the user journey and basically say, well, you either let me use third-party cookies whilst they exist and we'll target you that way, or you sign in, and then we defer to your marketing preferences. So we're not just going to track you, it's the marketing preferences you gave us when you signed up, and you can review them and change them at any time. And maybe when we get you to sign in, we prompt you to go and review your marketing choices to make sure that we're only marketing to you in the way that you've agreed. But maybe that's something that some retailers could look at, where there's this really strong signed in benefit to them and to the user for signing up for an account. Perhaps that's something that retailers could look at. But as I say, it hasn't been taken forward by the retailer that we spoke to, but it is being taken forward by some publishers, and so it's perhaps something that companies should look at.
If you're looking at Google Analytics, which obviously a lot of websites use, especially small, medium-sized, to track how people are getting to the website and how people are using it, or GA4, the current iteration of that. A couple questions for you about that. So first, would that be considered, with the data that you're collecting in GA4, is that considered first party or third party? How does that work?
First party.
First party.
So that's your first party digital data.
That's because your account that you've installed on your website is staying on your domain. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And by and large using first party cookies as well. But yes, very much that would be first party data.
That makes sense. With Google, they have a couple different things. They have consent mode, and they have enhanced conversions on the Google Ads side of things. I'd love to dig into that a little bit with you, if that's something that you've dealt with much. Starting with consent mode, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that consent mode kind of applies across all of Google's tags, so it can be GA4, it could be Google Ads, etc. Could you kind of walk me through what is consent mode, how does that work, and are there different levels of consent?
Yeah, sure. So I think consent mode for me is Google's reflection that. So I think it reflects a few things in the wider market, and Google have done a good job sort of bringing this to the fore and talking about it basically. Because a few other vendors don't really do that. I think Microsoft is starting to do it through Bing, and there's a Bing tags consent mode as well. But it feeds into two broader kind of macro things that are happening. One of those is platforming, so multiple tools as part of a single platform. And if you look at Google, you've got the Google tag, so the G tag and the G tag will serve Google Analytics, Google Ads, DoubleClick, Search Ads, CM360. It serves all of the GMP, the Google Marketing Platform, and it's this single tag. So if you think about that from a cookies and a tag control perspective, what's actually important is the downstream usage of the data, but that's happening server side. And then that's the second macro thing that's happening in the industry at the moment, which is server side. So if you take platforming, lots of tools on a single platform, so the Adobe Experience platform is another example where there's lots of tools that feed from a single data feed. And then you also look at server side, so something like server side GTM is probably the biggest server side tag management platform at the moment, where you can take a single feed of data and not just serve it to Google Ads and DoubleClick and GA4, but you can also serve it to your other third-party vendor tags. So you could take that GA4 stream of data, which is what it usually gets sent as, although it doesn't have to be. You can take that single stream of data and you can distribute that data to your meta tags, to your TikTok tags, and that can all be done server-side. There's no client-side control over that, because you're just sending the data stream. So I need, if a customer has only accepted analytics tags, I need to be able to control the downstream usage of that data to make sure that it's not getting used for remarketing. And so that's where consent mode comes in, because what it does is it requires you to set some data onto your page before you send any tags, to describe what the user has accepted in a way that Google's marketing platform understands. And so it's things like, you've accepted analytics storage, but you haven't accepted advertising storage, or you've accepted neither. And then that controls what the downstream tags will do. So if you send data, because the other thing is GA4 can send audiences to Google Ads.
Right.
Like you can do a connection, and beyond, you can do a connection into all of the Google marketing platform. You can create audiences in GA4 and then use them for remarketing. Unless you send a signal with consent mode to say that analytics storage has been accepted, but advertising storage is not, in which case those users are removed, and so they are not shared with the audience sharing to the wider GMP. So your consent mode is really, really important, because it's starting that conversation. I think it's going to get more and more prevalent, and more vendors are going to start to do it, and Google are obviously leading the charge on this, because they have a lot of downstream interconnections between their different platforms. That it's the start of this thing of, send me from the client via this single data stream what I am allowed to do with this data once it reaches me, so that I don't inadvertently forward this information on. If a user is identified by Google as being in the European Economic Area, and you haven't set consent mode at all, you're just sending data as you always would, you cannot use that data for remarketing. Even if you're sending it to Google Ads, you can't use it. It's excluded. So consent mode, and that's the thing that I think Google did a bad job of, which is, I think they told us about it in January and it had to be deployed by February, or we were told about it in February and it had to be done like the month later. And I have some thoughts about why that might be, but it put a lot of pressure on people to just implement it, and one of the things that you could have implemented was advanced consent mode, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, but by and large, I think consent mode's a good thing, and it's that downstream control.
That makes sense. So yeah, let's talk about that advanced. So you've got, I think they call it basic consent mode, and then they've got the next level up, advanced consent mode, which, forgive my ignorance, I think part of advanced consent mode relates to being able to fire some things pre-consent. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but
yes,
I'll stop talking. Tell me more about advanced, if you would, and how that works.
No, absolutely. And it's really, really confusing, and it's all down to the name, because it sounds like there's some sort of tick box that you do in your setup to make it be advanced consent mode or make it be basic, but actually it's purely contextual. And what it is if you, so let's go back to that site you with the cookie banner, and you've implemented your site correctly and nothing fires before the user has granted consent. So you've loaded the page for the first time and the banner is there. If you set Google Analytics 4 before consent has been granted, but you are using consent mode properly, then it will send data to the GA4 endpoint, but it won't set a cookie. This is controlling that downstream usage, because what's going to happen, what used to happen would be, is you'd run your script, it would go and hit the GA endpoint, and then that would retrieve some cookies and it would set the cookies to the web page. What's now happening is you're sending that hit to the GA endpoint, you set it with consent mode, it knows that consent has not been granted. So with consent mode, essentially you deny consent by default. Every single page load you deny consent by default, and then before you fire your tags that you want to receive information, you will run an update, assuming that they have been consented to. So what advanced consent mode is you've denied consent by default, then you've sent data to GA4, there's been no update, so it knows, based on the parameters that get sent when they hit to GA4, that consent has been denied by default and there's been no update. Therefore, the response from GA, it won't set a cookie, and so it's going to track them as cookieless hits, essentially. So every time you reload the page, you get a new identifier every single time, and so it can't physically join those together. So that conversation that we had right at the very start as to what is the purpose of a cookie, to persist a value from one page load to the next, advanced consent mode is not persisting a value from one page to the next, so it can't tie those together. What Google can then do on their side is they can look at the data that has been consented and that has cookie IDs, and they can look at the data that hasn't, and then they can model the data that hasn't using the consented data as a training model, and so they can re-sessionize it and they can turn it into user data in inverted commas, even though it actually doesn't relate to a user cookie. But fundamentally, on the client side, on the browser, no cookie is set.
Let me see if I can understand that correctly. So you've got, let's pick round numbers. Let's say 50% of the people coming to the website have said accept, and so you're allowed to track them. 50% haven't. So if you have advanced consent set up, Google's basically saying, okay, the 50% of people who have not accepted or have not consented to cookies, they are saying, hey, we know somebody got to the home page. They're not adding a cookie, so they don't know inherently if the person went from the home page, then went to the contact us page, filled out a form, etc. But Google does know what the 50% of people who did consent did. And so it looks at, kind of extrapolates and models and say, okay, well, these people did X. And so based upon that, we guess or estimate or extrapolate that this other 50% of people did roughly X as well. Is that?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And then the difference between advanced consent mode and basic consent mode, and you can see with the naming there which one they prefer you to do. The difference between advanced consent mode and basic consent mode is exactly what we described earlier, which is you don't fire the hit to GA4 at all until the user has granted consent, and then you send it. And essentially what happens is the page loads. Initially you set default consent to declined. Your consent management tool loads, it returns a value, it says, okay, we've accepted analytics cookies, good news. We run an update to say analytics storage is accepted, then you run your GA tag, it picks up that information and it says, great, I can set a cookie. And that happens on every page load from then on in. So that's your difference between advanced and basic.
Okay. Got it. So you'll wind up with more total data when using advanced. It won't necessarily be 100% accurate because there is a modeling and extrapolation component of it, but it will probably give you a better sense of what's going on than basic. Is that fair?
Pretty much, but the key thing is within the Google platform.
Within your Google platform. Mm-hmm.
So if you export your data via BigQuery integration to your cloud environment, you need to, I would suggest, treat the advanced consent mode data differently. Otherwise, you'll get massive inflation of user volumes. So you need to figure out a way to either to try and replicate what Google are doing, very difficult, because they also have Google Signals, so they've got their signed-in user base, and they've got, if you're sending like hashed identifiers to them as well, they can use that too. When you export via BigQuery, you don't get any of the post-model data. And you don't get any of the Google Signals data, any of the data that they use to join that back together. So you would then see quite a big discrepancy between the numbers you see within the GA4 interface and what you see in your exported data. Your exported data is what Google would call observed only, not model. So just one to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is, I think if your site has relatively low traffic, sort of under 1,000 users a day, that's a guess, I'm pulling that from memory, but I think it's around 1,000 users a day, the modeling won't work. And you may actually see that your traffic of observed data is tracking along very nicely, and then suddenly it drops off a cliff as soon as you put advanced consent mode in, because it's trying to build those models and to recreate that data set, and then it never gets to the threshold, and you've essentially ruined your GA4 implementation. So just be careful before implementing advanced consent mode is my advice.
So it would go down after advanced, and is that? I'm trying to wrap my head around why that actually makes the numbers go down.
It's difficult to say. The best I can say is it's a bit of a black box. And so a lot of people have reported putting in advanced consent mode and then seeing their data drop off a cliff, and with no real SLAs for when it's going to go back again. So it's one of the main complaints that we've seen around GA4. Even sites with huge amounts of data will have a period of it disappearing, and then it'll come back and backfill, and it'll be like nothing ever happened. But I tested it. So the Loop Horizon website, you might be surprised to hear, doesn't get 1,000 visitors a day, and I tested it, and that's exactly what happened. I put advanced consent mode in, and the whole thing dropped off a cliff.
Gotcha.
So I've shown that that's the case. Why it is the case is more difficult to say, but it's what people are seeing.
That's super important to know. So for anybody watching, listen to this. If you have less than 1,000 a day, be very, very careful about installing advanced.
Yeah, probably stick to basic and keep your GA4 property looking at observed or possibly blended, but try and avoid the model. But I think probably keep it to observed.
Well, I want to be sensitive of your time here, Matt. I've got maybe one or two more questions, and then we can wrap up if that works for you. Enhanced conversions. I'd love to ask you about that. That kind of goes back, like you mentioned, the idea of, hey, Google's got this signed-in data for people. Do you deal much with enhanced conversions on the Google Ads side of things with your clients?
Less so than I do with consent mode. I get enhanced conversions mixed up a little bit with user-provided data. I think it's very, very similar. You're providing hashed email addresses usually. From a user-provided data perspective, so if we just talk a second about Google Signals. Google Signals is third-party cookie-based, and it's augmenting your data with data from Google, so like demographics and interest data. Mm-hmm. User-provided data is you're providing them with now a hashed identifier for the user, and it's going to do a similar kind of job. It's going to look, but rather than matching on third-party cookies, it's going to match on the hashed identifier and bring that data in, so it's a lot more accurate. My understanding is, I'm less familiar with enhanced conversions, but my understanding is it's a similar thing. You're providing the hashed ID, and then it's using that to make the conversions data more accurate in Google Ads. But I'll hands up, I'm less familiar with that than I am with the other implementations.
Yeah, I've definitely seen Google be pushing that harder and harder. I mean, they pushed it for a long time, but they're always pushing it because of the realities that the rest of our conversation has been about, which is that there's just more and more gaps in tracking as people, I guess, comply more and more on the consent side of things.
Because you're relying on third-party cookies for the matchback, and not just in Safari, but within Chrome as well. The people with ad blockers, just third-party cookies they're not reliable anymore. So the user-provided data, the enhanced conversions, providing that hashed identifier, because Google's got probably the largest first-party data set in the world. Thereabouts, it's got to be, and that's billions upon billions of emails. Pretty good chance they're going to be able to find that email and match back against it, which is going to be a lot more accurate than a third-party cookie. I think one thing to call out that I found recently is if you're using Google Signals, now we're talking GA4, if you're using Google Signals and you switch to user-provided data and you start providing hashed email addresses, at the moment Google Signals switches off. So it's an either-or. And also, I believe you can't turn it back on again by removing user-provided data. I think it's a one-way door. So once you've done it, it's done. Now, I was at a conference, not last weekend, but the weekend before, talking to somebody, and they were saying they're going to hopefully allow it for you to have both. So you can have Google Signals and user-provided data, but if you are using Google Signals at the moment, it's probably worth holding off. And if you've got a Google rep, like hit them up and ask them, when that's going to be done. Because we have a client who has a lot of brochureware sites, so purely brand building, no logins, no sales, and so using Google Signals is very, very useful for them. They have a relatively small CRM platform that allows you to sign in and get offers, and we're using one instance of GA across all of them to basically create a unified view, like with cross-domain tracking and things like that. And then we're going to create audiences and share them with the wider Google marketing platform to orchestrate against those audiences. So it would be fantastic if we could send hashed email addresses to GA4 as part of user-provided data, so that we're either getting a match rate from a third-party cookie or we're getting a match rate from the hashed email address if it exists. But at the moment we can't do that on that GA4 property because it would switch off for like 95% of the estate, which is brochureware. It would just turn off Google Signals, which we don't want.
That's something to watch and see if they enable both those features concurrently in the future. Cool.
Yeah, they're looking at it. So basically, Google Signals was going to go away because Chrome wasn't going to allow third-party cookies anymore. So then your only option would be user-provided data. But that's no longer happening. So now they just need to work on making them both play nicely together, which they didn't think they were going to have to do.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. As we wrap up here, for those who are watching, listening to this, who want to learn more about you, want to explore the idea maybe of working with Loop Horizon to get your help with their own websites, where are the best places that they can learn more and reach out to you?
So the best place to reach out to me is probably just on LinkedIn. I'm always open to connecting with new people, and then just send me a message. Cards on the table, I probably look at them about 2 or 3 times a week, so it wouldn't necessarily be instant, but that's a good place to start and to have a chat. Or alternatively, there is loophorizon.com, and we have a contact form on there, and then that would get sent to our CRM, and then our marketing team would reach out to me and let me know that someone was wanting to have a chat, and then I'd send you an email. So either of those is fine. And then if people want to sort of find out if I'm interesting and whether or not they actually do want to talk to me, I write a bunch of articles. So again, LinkedIn's probably a good place to start, is to go have a look at those articles. And if they resonate with you and they deal with problems that you're dealing with, then by all means reach out.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes and description. So Matt's LinkedIn profile, loophorizon.com. Fantastic. Well, Matt, really appreciate the time. I learned a lot. I'm confident people watching and listening will as well. And so thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me today.
Lovely. Thank you very much.